Wonderful. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us and welcome to the SIOP 2021 special session on psychological safety. I am David Geller. I am the chair for this session, and I would love to introduce and welcome my three panelists, Amy Edmondson at Harvard, Ethan Burris at Texas, and Brian Welle at Google. If I mentioned this in last year's session as well, but if you haven't heard of any of these individuals, please make sure that you go and look up their full bios, that their full information, and do your research. These are three world leaders in this area, and it's worth knowing about them in case you don't already. We also have a fifth person joining us behind the scenes who you're not seeing, Lauren. She is our Zoom technical facilitator. She'll be helping on the Zoom side. Thank you, Lauren, for joining us. I appreciate it. If at any point in the conversation, folks, you have any questions, please enter those questions into the chat box. We have disabled the video and audio to make this simplistic. We anticipate this being a good turnout. We want to make sure that everyone is able to benefit from the conversation and not being distracted by the rest of the elements as well. But to introduce this is a part 2 session on the same topic regarding psychological safety from last year's SIOP. We do have a recording of that session. If you'd like to access that recording, please send me an email at davidsgeller@gmail.com, and we will talk about that. And this will be a little bit different than a lot of other sessions. As I was talking with Brian just before the session started, and Ethan, and as I was preparing for this session, and we had side conversations to make sure we were preparing for it and all on the same page, I kept thinking, what's the right approach? And I was trying to put together a slide deck, a PowerPoint presentation that facilitated dialogue. But just as like I mentioned last year, this is not about what's on the screen, but this is more about conversation with and amongst these three leading experts. So we don't have a PowerPoint deck this year. We don't have anything to facilitate that. I have my own notes. But there's going to be a series of questions, and I'm going to be facilitating a conversation with and amongst these three. And on that note, Amy, Brian, and Ethan, just like we've discussed in the past, as we're talking, I will direct certain questions to specific people. Please push each other. Please challenge each other. Ethan, I think that you challenged first last year. I think you challenged Brian last year and received the response of, "Oh, thanks, Ethan." But please do that again this year. And let's just have a deeper conversation. We're all here because we want to figure out what's next with this topic. This is a really important topic. It's a topic that's receiving a lot of attention in the public and research and practice. A lot of people are talking about this topic. Our goal is to figure out where do we need to go next in order to help organizations figure out how to do this well. My personal goal is that I hope this stimulates you, the participants. I hope this stimulates your minds. I hope that this leads to some impactful research that has real life implications for answering the so what. I hope that this produces some ideas for practitioners who can bring back to your organizations and test those out. Maybe even some partnerships between the academics and the practitioners as well. This is a topic ripe for both new research and new practice. Overall, the goal is to help move forward. We know a lot about what leaders individually can do within their interpersonal relationships with their direct reports to create a culture of psychological safety. Where we would like to continue to go forward is at the organizational level, to how can we take a more strategic approach to put together a plan for what psychological safety might look like. And so we're going to try to talk about what that looks like at all different levels. So I like to also put one disclaimer in here, given that especially this is being recorded and that we have three esteemed experts here. This is going to be a conversation based on their expert opinion. They're going to be drawing from some research sometimes, they're going to be drawing from their own experiences sometimes, but this is not going to be citing empirically supported research at every moment. I like to have the freedom to be able to speculate, to be able to hypothesize and think about what could be. So I would ask the audience, anybody who's watching this, to please don't cite this conversation as being attributable to these three unless you have their explicit consent. That would allow me, and I think to feel more comfortable that we can go into the exploratory and hypothetical world and let our minds wander without fear of being misattributed in the future. So I would ask that that disclaimer, that you take heed to that disclaimer pretty seriously. So with that, let's get into it. I'd like to introduce the conversation in a certain direction. When we talk about environments that lack psychological safety, I think it's really easy to think about times that you have felt psychologically unsafe. We often talk about fear. We talk about fear of speaking up, fear of taking risks, fear of failure. Amy, I'm going to start with you. You often talk to this concept of failure. You provide an interesting juxtaposition. I've read this many times that you've talked about this. So if you're not sure what I'm talking about, I'm happy to be more clear. But you provide an interesting juxtaposition in an organization between the actual cause of failure in an organizational setting as being blameworthy or not, and how failure is typically or commonly treated in those organizational settings as blameworthy or not. I know this is not groundbreaking, but to start here, what does your research and experience say about this? I've seen you write about this a lot.
I'm sorry, it's not groundbreaking. Just kidding. And you're absolutely right. I mean, it's not groundbreaking. I have often, so talk about not formal empirical research. I've often asked rooms full of managers the following question, which is, I'll explain this idea that something goes wrong, product falls flat, someone gets hurt. I mean, you name it. Think of something that has gone wrong in your own workplace in the last few years. It could be caused by a blameworthy act, right? It could be caused by someone deliberately violating a rule that you hold dear, or deliberately showing up to work impaired, or any number of other things that we would, I think, all be willing to call a blameworthy act. It could be caused by just plain incompetence, right? And it could be caused by not paying attention. And we can go up this spectrum from clearly blameworthy to it could have been caused by a very thoughtful experiment that failed to yield the results you dearly wanted and hypothesized about, right? And that's clearly not a blameworthy act at all. That's a praiseworthy act. And so my question to audience is the following. One, what % of failures in your organization do you suspect are caused by blameworthy act? And the answer is almost uniformly a very tiny number, right? I mean, most people feel about their organizations that their employees are not going out of their way to break rules and do bad things to lead to failure. So, okay, good, right? We're on the same page. Second question, what % of failures, things that go wrong, get treated as if they were caused by a blameworthy act? And here's where, after a nervous laugh or two, the numbers are larger, right? The numbers are anywhere from, well, a lot of them to most of them. And that's clearly illogical, right? I mean, that we can sort of scientifically conclude this isn't blameworthy and yet respond as if it were, which of course is both is illogical, but it's also very human. But what does that do then to innovation, right? What does that do to people's fear levels and their willingness to try things, to experiment, to do some of those praiseworthy acts? And more importantly, what does it do to their overall fear level about coming forward, about anything, an idea, a concern, a question, a mistake, you name it?
Thanks, Amy. And when I say that it's not groundbreaking, I mean that I've seen it, you write about it many times. And so us talking about it here is not new.
Okay, right, not new, but truly, David, it's common sense, but uncommon practice.
Yeah, and I've actually used that in workshops that I've created around the topic of psych safety or presentations around psych safety. I think that's such a fascinating thing that just hits home with so many people. Of most of these failures or errors are typically due to the system, the systematic level, due to the process, due to some other environmental factor, not attributable to that individual. Brian, I'm going to turn this to you and bring up something that, played out publicly at Google, if you're willing to talk about it, or we can talk about it more hypothetically. Google recently experienced something in the public arena, the termination of one of your lead artificial intelligence officers. And I know that that was reported in the news, so it's not something that we're just divulging here. Can you speak about the actual, or if that's not comfortable, a hypothetical impact, whether at Google or at any other organization that something like that might have?
Yeah, I won't speak specifically about that instance, David, but I think from a larger perspective, psychological safety you can actually apply psychological safety to multiple aspects of situations like this. For example, internally, do we have an environment where people can speak up and challenge the status quo, address problems where they exist, and then how is that responded to? Then the next question is, how did you do that? Are there norms, guidelines, feedback that you can get in the expression of those? There's also then, once an event happens, how do we process that internally? How do we process that externally? Or is there no room for processing at all? Every single piece of a lead up to an event, the processing of the event, the aftermath, and whether it results in any kind of change, systemic change internally, is where dialogue is important. Trust between leaders and employees are important. Community amongst employees themselves. A perspective on the multiple points of view and how we're going to have a constructive dialogue. None of that is possible if you don't already have a strong footing on psychological safety. My experience just working in organizational settings is psychological safety isn't something that you can turn on the moment you need it. It needs to have been an investment for a long period of time in order for people to engage in it, because you have to trust the people that you're working with. You have to know that if you do speak up, there's that it's going to be a safe place. Like that safety is often proven through past interactions and past experience and observation. So that is why culturally, you started by saying, what do we need to do organizationally in order to have psychologically safe environments? And I think that's almost the right question for many of us who are working with organizations is, what are you doing now to invest in an environment where psychological safety is more of a norm rather than an exception across teams? And I know that was very general. Your question was very specific. My answer was very general. And that was on purpose for this particular issue, but hopefully there's something there worth digging into.
No, I knew it was a targeted, sensitive question, so I appreciate the response. I hope you don't mind the question, given that it did play out publicly. I want to point people's attention also, there was a question in chat about, can you provide a specific example of something being treated as blameworthy? And Amy provided a response in here as well. Hospitalized patient receives a dangerous overdose of medication because of 8 unrelated small process failures that lined up in just the wrong way. So Amy, thank you for responding to that, and thanks for the question, Catherine, as well. Brian, thanks for that response. It's interesting. You mentioned how you can't just conjure psych safety. I think this is similar for trust as well when you need it, but you can break it, right? It can be broken in a very short time period with one specific act. Somebody sees an egregious act. Somebody sees somebody being treated as if the error or failure were their fault. And now there are other people in the organization are seeing this, and now they don't want to speak up. Now they're afraid because they think about, well, what if that's me? Ethan, I'll go to you. If an organization has people who are afraid to take risks, who are afraid to speak up, afraid to express their voice, what's the cost? I know it's a loaded question with the complex and nuanced responses. Like, what's the business case here? Like, what is the real cost of doing this? Is it just a matter of like how I feel as an employee, or can you speak to that a bit?
Yeah, so I'm going to answer a different question first. I'm going to come back to that just real quick, but I want to make sure that we connect back to some of the themes that both Brian and Amy brought up, because I think it's really important to acknowledge those as we start to understand the true costs of silence, of withholding ideas in organizations. And so when we talk about some of these reasons why it's uncomfortable for either managers to admit mistakes, or to counsel employees when mistakes are made, or build in time, as Brian mentioned, to have that sense-making process. I think so much of us focus squarely on the one event, Like, it's really easy to point out when a manager sort of misbehaves and reacts poorly to getting challenged, or reacts poorly and tries to cover up a particular mistake. But there's lots of other systems and organizations that reinforce that desire and the natural tendency for most of us to want to appear like we are competent and good and almost infallible in what we do in organizations. So if you look at even things like performance management systems or compensation philosophies, most of the time we reinforce when people are infallible, when they do well, when they perform well and don't make mistakes. And even if someone is nice and can talk about a mistake in the abstract, but it's not reinforced later on with some of these other systems in place in organizations, then that's where a lot of people start to see mixed signals. And so I want to make sure we kind of draw that out, that it's not just behaviorally, it's not just addressing kind of the psychology of managers and how they respond or encourage these types of discussions, that also has to be embedded in some of these other systems, really from the top down in terms of how we design perf and comp and things like that, because those tend to reinforce the very behaviors and some of the psychology that we're experiencing. So that was one. And then you asked very specifically about some of the outcomes of silence. So if organizations don't do this and we kind of create this system in place where people are afraid to admit mistakes or call out problems, at least in some of my research, we've really focused on kind of three sets of outcomes. There's sort of the attitudinal outcomes that employees experience. So if you don't feel like you can speak up, or when you do, you feel like you are not heard, it impacts your relationship with the organizations, the attitudes that you feel about the place. Where that results more behaviorally are things like turnover. So you start to draw back, you detach from the organization, and there's a greater likelihood of exiting. Secondly, it impacts what I'll call kind of the concrete outcomes of employees. So these are things like performance evaluations, but also their actual performance. So in sales teams, if employees can speak up about the problems they encounter in the sales process, action is taken on that, their individual performance will improve. We've seen a delta of about between 12 and 20% improvements in sales performance. So from the individuals. And then lastly, you can think about this happening in the context of teams or collective units, business units, et cetera. And so for those leaders who receive a lot of voice, and again, take action on those ideas, we see that those units that those leaders are in charge of also improve their financial, operational performance. And again, that delta is roughly about 20%, at least in these financial service organizations. So it's both attitudinal, it's concrete outcomes for the individuals who want to speak up, but also for those leaders who receive feedback and can actually address some of the issues that are happening in their unit.
Ethan, a thought comes to mind as I'm hearing you talk about the impact on financial-based outcomes, which are very, tangible, objectively measured as well. Would you expect that a similar outcome you can measure, or find a way to measure a similar outcome for units who are not necessarily working in an arena where you can specifically measure quantifiable outcomes? Does it all kind of lead up to the organizational level? Does it all impact each other, or do you think this more specifically applies to and is more directly seen in those kinds of units or teams?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'll provide nuance in sort of two different ways. One is I say voice has these impacts, or lack of voice. Silence has these types of impacts in these three different areas. But almost all the time, the raw correlations are actually relatively flat. And I say that because it takes two to tango. Having voice gets the ideas out on the table, and then managers have to do something with it. And so if managers don't, then it actually has a negative effect across all these different types of outcomes. So it's a balance in between both employees and managers. And so because of that, we also see, from a research design standpoint, I'm looking for the impact of voice in measurable things, financial performance, operational performance. And so that's the reason why I kind of gave some of those examples. But of course, there's lots of jobs where measuring performance is a lot more difficult. Since I called out Brian last time, I'm going to do the same this time. Google has a number of software engineers. It's hard to measure with specific metrics the performance of an individual software developer. And so, it's not just lines of code. It's not how fast you type. It's hard, but we can pick that up in different ways. So you start to look at teams of engineers, how they're evaluated, how the handoff from their code to the next team works. And through some of those 360 evaluations, we start to see, honestly, a very similar picture as some of the more, objective metrics that are out there. And so from an academic, that gives me a bit more confidence that some of these dynamics that we're observing is not just a function of sales teams and sort of the uniqueness of sales employees, but we see this across software. Amy's done so much work in the healthcare system. We see this in a number of different avenues that all start to produce very similar dynamics.
Brian, any response?
You hit on a lot there, Ethan. I'm gonna go down one direction, and we can go down the performance management one too if you want to. But I always try to keep in mind why psychological safety matters. And Amy, I go back to your fundamental research and observation that psychological safety leads to good outcomes because it's an opportunity to learn. And so if I have seen technically psychologically safe environments in which there's no negative consequence to raising dissenting points of view, but if there's no action that's taken from that, what happens is you're not punished for speaking up, but you observe that nothing happened when you did, so you just choose not to. And so this has been something that I've been thinking, even with like the employee opinion survey, other ways of collecting employee feedback. Sometimes we want to know what people think. We've got an environment where they can express themselves, but if we never use it, they'll stop expressing themselves, or they'll have felt that because I've expressed myself and made my point of view known, and I know other people believe the same because I've seen the statistics and you've chosen not to do anything, I will find another way to make that happen. You've raised the expectation, and now there's this, how am I going to take action on it? And so we're being very careful in helping managers and team members understand what to do. So the way that we engage with psychological safety at the team level now is not only asking questions in a survey like, do you feel safe to raise your point of view? We in our manager expectations have your responsibilities to take that point of view in and take action on it when appropriate, right? You need to connect it to action. And without that, you actually can have a psychologically safe environment, but with no new contributions from which to learn. And then there are some things that we really do need employee input on, but the process of taking action on it takes some time. And it's not an immediate, I've asked you and you've told me, and I will then turn it around and do something completely different. This usually is a set of issues that happen at the aggregate overall view, like what I need to do as a leader of a whole company, how I want to invest in culture change over the long run. We as psychologists need to collect data and employee viewpoints on these very issues. And then we work with leaders and management teams to over time transform issues. But if we don't help employees understand how their voice can be responsibly used in moments like that, it can lead to a lot of frustration. And I think we're seeing this play out quite a bit. And we see many companies now whose employees are, going directly to the press or are finding other actors who engage in a system to help drive the change that they expected to be taken internally because they've expressed themselves internally. Amy, I'd be curious to see if you've seen some of these dynamics play out and if you have a point of view on it.
And if I could add to that, Amy, before you respond to that, I see a question in chat that I think fits within that topic as well, of if psych safety is so easily lost and hard to gain, how do you recover from that as well if it is lost? So I'd love if you can try to work that into your response to Brian too.
Actually, that second part, I think is something that we could all maybe talk about a little, because I think once you recognize the challenge, right, that asymmetry, which is quite clear, then you realize that recovery is as big a part of this discussion as the creation of a more inviting, inclusive environment in the first place. But let me go back to the whole issue of, and we've been looking at this for a long time, but this whole issue of I spoke up, nothing happened, and I think the way you put it, Brian, is very provocative and thoughtful, because what happens is that can be felt as a punishment, right? Even though it's not an obvious punishment, you didn't get dissed, your voice was welcomed, but it can be, I think it can be experienced as a punishment if there isn't any sense making to the contrary, right? So I spoke up, no one did anything, that feels bad. It feels like a rebuke, even though it's absolutely not necessarily a rebuke. So this leads me to think that we have to pay attention to the rules of engagement, or the processes through which work improves, and through which we learn, and through which we make decisions. Like, we have to be quite explicit about how those things work. So I love that you started out with that fundamental relationship between psychological safety and learning, right? That's the baseline, I think, against which all of these things can be compared. And so what happens in those moments, if someone speaks up and they conclude that nothing happened, nothing changed, they may or may not have learned the right lesson, right? They may have learned, in fact, the wrong lesson. It may be that their thoughts were very much heard, taken into consideration, and indeed influenced the things that unfolded from there. Or it may be that they were heard, and for a variety of very good reasons, we chose to go a different way, but they never got the feedback, right? They never got that information. Or it may be that they were simply ignored and they were right. It was a sham exercise. But if people don't have any way to tell the difference between those outcomes, they're not learning, and we're all, then people are in trouble. So I want to call this dimension, something like process discipline, or clarity about the rules of engagement, right? Is this a report, and I'd love to hear what's going on for you type of meeting? Is this a decision-making meeting? Is this a meeting where I'm going to get input from you, think about it very deeply, and make the final call as my job requires? Or what kind of setting is this? And ultimately, no matter what kind of setting, like, be clear about what kind of setting it is, and then ultimately also let people know they've been heard, right? So there's that, the speaking up culture has to also be the listening up culture, where people are have the satisfaction of being heard, which of course relates to the fairness work, procedural justice work as well.
I'll jump in there as well. I think that's a fascinating concept, to start to also look at this over time. I don't know about you, Amy, but so much of my time when I teach some of this stuff in class, a lot of students, they like the concept of voice, but it's almost like for a drop the mic type of opportunity. Like, I'm going to go in, I'm going to speak my mind, and then it's up to everyone else to then figure out what to do with it.
Right.
And
right.
Starting to understand how this plays out over time. Like, what is the transparency of the process afterwards? What's happening with the idea? Is it still under consideration? Is it such a thorny issue that it's going to take months to fully evaluate? Like, these are such nuances that, ultimately circle back and impact that individual employee's feelings if, they lend their ideas and they're expecting an answer in 2 weeks. And if not, then they start to check out.
Absolutely. And psychological safety is not an opportunity to create everybody else's to-do list for them. Right? As you say, I don't get to just say, hey, here's all the things that are wrong, go fix them, right? In fact, why it makes sense for different people to speak up is that everybody has different pieces of the puzzle, and the solution is going to be a team sport, right?
Yeah, and I think it's interesting having these conversations in this kind of a setting as academics where we make conscious all the dynamics. Also, when we're talking to employees explicitly about voice, they'll think about these moments when they were explicitly asked or invited and then gave voice and expect outcome. The reality, though, is I think the majority of the environment and expressions that revolve around psychological safety are almost done unconsciously. They're like moment by moment. Oh, I saw something I didn't like. Am I going to give feedback? Or somebody told me something. I was like, oh, that totally makes sense. I'm going to incorporate it. True, I would say that the most powerful expressions of voice in a psychologically safe environment happen moment by moment, almost unconsciously. Like it's just the environment in which we're operating. Right. And that's what we need to maximize through norms, through culture, manager role modeling and the like. And then this other layer, which is I have this moment where I can give feedback, where there's this big thing happening in my organization that I have a point of view on. That's important too, and easier to talk about, but I think it might be 10%.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Right, these big issue things, big deal things.
So what about that other topic too? Let's say that
recovery. Yeah, what do people think? I mean, to me, my headline on that one is come clean, right? Name it, acknowledge it. You know, something bad happened here, and take responsibility, and then invite people back in. Say, here's our aspiration. We need your help, right? So it's the one thing you cannot do is sort of hope it goes away, hope recovery happens on its own. I think it has to be named. It has to be an explicit project where we're gonna do our best. We're all gonna work together to do this, because the patients, the customers, you name it, whatever the context, are counting on us.
I think it's a great point. So if we're going to expect employees to be honest and candid with us, that is to speak their minds in an authentic way, but we're not honest and candid back and saying, hey, I totally botched this. Yep. I'm sorry. Right. I promise to do better. Like right. that seems like a natural thing to do. And if you're not willing to do that, then it seems like there's an imbalance there. So I think it's a fascinating point.
Yeah, that need for latitude, or that to deserve latitude when you do mess up, applies to the leaders, not just to their direct reports, right?
Right.
Yeah, and one of the things that I've noticed is not all managers even know when they are not inviting. Multiple points of view. They could be quite confident in their approach. They might feel that their responsibility as a manager is to channel this team in a particular direction, and I know what that direction is. There's often not this intentional desire to prevent voice and learning, but it happens. And so for that set of managers, recovery is almost not one single incident. It could be something that unfolds over the long run. So how do we knock them out of that? That's where we have found the ability to survey and collect points of view and then present it in a moment to a manager as the aha moment. And so if that's also paired with awareness and a coach or other support from HR, it can be a moment of resetting norms with the team. So our challenge has been, okay, so we're going to accept that we have a wide variance in psychological safety across teams in our organization. We know we have made a commitment as an organization to move all teams to the right hand of that curve and sort of reset it. So how are we going to identify and then present moments and then support to move those teams over? That's been a lot of hard work for us, but I would say having measures that can aggregate the viewpoint so that you can have sort of a moment of intervention with the manager has been tremendously powerful.
And Brian, for anybody who's listening that might be interested in, oh, well, I'd like to move teams over like that, are you able to speak more to, or are you laying it out there that it's about identifying it, being transparent, providing support and coaching, and not being in a punitive way. Is that the entirety of it, or is that really that simple, or is there more to it?
So the best thing is if you have a manager who's more aware of you, and in the context of your one-on-ones, you can like sit down with that. So it's almost like you keep going up until you end up at the like CEO and the board of directors, and you know it needs to be role modeled there. So the number one best coach is going to be your own manager. But there are also then mentors that you can have. There is like an OD expert that you can have through HR. We have found scale is a real challenge when it comes down to requiring somebody from HR to actually sit with somebody and then coach them over the long run. I mean, we've got the percentage of HR to the rest of the organization is tiny, as it should be for a well-functioning organization. So I would say where I'm really curious in experimentation and research right now is sort of scaled online assistance. And can that be effective at getting people to learn new behaviors in this kind of a realm? We do have support mechanisms that you can like click to, you can read, you can go through exercises online. We also have very thoughtful emails that will go out once a month to the manager community about issues that we have heard, like, hey managers, we know that this, like for example, managing a team working from home during a pandemic is a work challenge, a personal challenge for you, and an emotional challenge for your team. Let's have a moment where you consider the following. And then we've even experimented with manager live streams, which would be we set a time and any manager who wants to contribute can sort of log in, and we have our internal experts aligned. Now, where we haven't been able to go as far as I would like is measuring the effectiveness of those kinds of interventions on team norms, dynamics, and psychological safety. And that's where, you had mentioned earlier, David, if we could come out of sessions like this with better pairing between practitioners and academics, I think that kind of robust measurement is where measurement and then insights from it is where the pairing would be magical.
So I have a question kind of building on that. So I think what's fascinating about what you're doing there, Brian, is for focusing specifically on managers that may not be as aware that they're not getting the type of feedback, not creating the type of psych safety environment that what they would like. And so that almost assumes, I think with good reason, that most of us have good intentions. It's not sort of present and on our mind that we're doing things that would create a culture that looks otherwise. And so for me, that really does connect with a lot of Amy's work on what she calls implicit voice theories. And so these are implicit rules that most employees have about how safe it is to speak up or when it is or is not. And so I'm sorry, I'm doing it again, David. I'm putting some of my panelists on the spot. So Amy, have you thought about like ways to address some of the implicit voice theories or what managers could do, but at scale? Because I hear that's sort of the need from Brian is to nudge some of this at scale, but those implicit voice, those lay beliefs about hierarchy are so embedded that it seems like pushing out a nudge via email may not hit it.
I think it's an empirical question, right? Maybe it does, right? Maybe a nudge by email does hit it, or a nudge by text or something else. But let me just say something about, thanks for bringing up the implicit theories, which is of course work with our mutual friend, Jim Dietert. But the thing we realized in the implicit voice theory research was that it wasn't all fear. Right? The holding back wasn't all fear. In fact, you could describe the implicit theories of voice as more aptly thought of as theories of appropriateness, almost like theories of what you do and what you don't do, right? Not sure why, I wouldn't speak up when my boss's boss is present. Like, doesn't everybody know that, right? There's this sort of feeling about it, or you just wouldn't speak up unless you had all your ducks in a row, right? Rock solid data, which in a highly uncertain context is almost never going to be the case. So therefore, you're not going to speak up, right? So in a sense, these theories are out of whack with what the work demands for excellence. And so this is a long-winded way of saying the way we think you might counteract this is through explicit theory communication, right? So through being quite explicit about many of the things that people are likely to have sort of codified in their mind, and just keep putting forward the opposing message, like half-baked ideas are the source of innovation around here, right? If your manager or your company in various ways is sort of telling you the half-baked ideas are, the first step in genius, right? Then you're kind of counteracting those taken for granted messages with an explicit message that says we're all ears, and you can do that for all of them.
Thanks for that conversation. Something that I think I hear a theme across these conversations is something that I we talked about in prior conversation as well. I'm going to try to tie in. When we talk about psych safety, we immediately think about that relationship between, the vertical relationship between the leader and their direct report. But as we know, at any organization, big or small, there are multiple levels of leadership, and they each contribute to that overall culture, the overall climate. And, I believe one of you had made a comment in the past that there might be a differential nature across the different responsibilities of leaders and how they have an impact on the overall culture or climate of psych safety at an organization. Do any of you have thoughts on, I'm happy to point to one of you if you like, but does anybody have a thought on what does that multi-level view look like for how leaders at different parts of the organization have an impact on that organization's psych safety that the front line, each individual employee experiences, keeping in mind that all those leaders also are experiencing their own psych safety or lack thereof too. So anybody have any thoughts on how to react to that and how to help people think about what does that differentiated responsibility look like at different levels of the organization?
I'm just going to say I'm quite sure Ethan has some good thoughts on that.
I think I probably deserve that. So I don't have hard and fast data on this. So this would be probably one of those things it's more on the opinion realm than backed with a lot of empirical evidence. But I think a lot of time employees have issues that are top of mind for them that they would like solved. And the natural place that they go is their immediate supervisor. But the issue is big enough or thorny enough or needs coordination across multiple units, if not policy for the whole organization, that direct supervisor doesn't have the authority, the resources, the capabilities, et cetera, to take action. And now all of a sudden, this sense of psych safety for the employee has to be embedded in this multi-level and multi-system type of view. I'll just give one example, and since you're recording this and it's not going out anywhere else, it's probably safe for me to say. We, in 3 or 4 weeks, are about to graduate a whole lot of students, and with the era of COVID, we're not having graduation live. It's going to be a virtual graduation, and for a number of our students, they're not super happy about that. So they're speaking up a lot to the local administration for each of the programs in pretty intense pressure to get those rules changed. And it's just not up to those people. And so, trying to take that up and then coordinating across multiple colleges, multiple campuses within a state and its rules and systems, yes, it is a question of psych safety, but it's also heavily embedded in all these other systems in place too, which just makes addressing that issue intricately difficult to do.
And again, psychological safety is not the same concept as democracy, right? It's technically an ability not to hold back based on fear of what people will think of you. It is not a free license to be in charge of the world. And when you're, the leaders of your organization or the public health experts have decided that something is not in the best interests of the organization and all of their stakeholders, that's just something you have to learn to live with. It doesn't mean you should feel afraid to express your view.
Yeah, if I can bring up, I think it's a related topic, but where I've seen leaders challenged over the last year and employees left wondering, and then me wondering as both a practitioner and also somebody with a scientific bent on psychological safety. Psychological safety, as we had first engaged in it as an organization, was very much about the work. Can I comment on the process that we've used? Can I give someone feedback on a mistake that I thought they had made? Can I take a moment to acknowledge my own mistake and learn from it? And will that be valued? We have had thousands of employees experiencing things outside of work that can impact their engagement and their concentration in work. Then the question has become, in light of the social injustice that I have seen and am affected by, the care that I need to give to a family member, just generally feeling anxious and depressed with the time that we're in. Is it safe for me to bring that up in work? I feel like a negative consequence might be if I acknowledge that I might not be 100% at work, that's going to affect my performance score. Managers are wondering, is it better to just keep everyone focused on work, and for the sake of harmony, let's just say on social justice issues? Wow, that sounds like it's going to be potentially explosive if I open that up to conversation. I guess so. The empirical side of me is wondering, to what extent is this a psychological safety issue, or have we moved into culture and then we sort of say, no, psychological safety has these boundaries on it, this is a different conversation? From a practical level, we have been invested in creating safe spaces for people to express those aspects of themselves that are important, with the acknowledgement that they are, it should be a healthy and a safe place for you to bring some of these things up, because it is impacting how you engage with your employees and the work and the mission of your company. And we don't want people to feel as though they're segmenting too much, because we actually think that will be extraordinarily disruptive to their own well-being and ability to show up for each other. So I don't know if you all have observed as well the importance of this topic, if you have a thought of whether this is or is not psychological safety, and then help Google employees, please.
Oh, I think this is one of the top leading edge topics. And some, maybe all of you know Mark Mortensen. He and I have recently been talking about this, and the way we've been framing it is we need to, we may need to expand the domain of psychological safety to encompass, because you're absolutely right, Brian. Historically, this was about the work relevant. So one question is, I mean, you're sort of saying, is this something else? I think my current view is no, this is about expanding the domain and recognizing that we're not going to get it right the first time. Like as we start to say, we absolutely need to all be more able and willing to talk about things that are difficult, that go beyond the work content. I can guarantee you we're going to make mistakes along the way. And, spotters ready. That's going to be okay. But I think we can't keep it separate. It just doesn't work that way. Maybe in part because so many of us have been working distally for over a year now. Maybe in part because of the extra and extra challenging social issues that have always been there, but are now much more discussed and discussable, and maybe in part because of the health domain, right? As many people are worried about coming back from health perspectives, and they don't know whether it's okay to speak up about things that would ordinarily be absolutely personal or private. And correspondingly, companies don't know whether it's okay to ask. And so I think that we're gonna have to navigate this new terrain. But I think you're right to say we got to figure out ways to do this.
So I actually do have some data on some of this. So in one study, we asked folks not only their frequency of speaking up, but around about a dozen different topic areas. And some of it was very task related. What's the overall mission of the organization? What's the task that you do, coordinating with others? Others of it was very personal. So identity related issues around diversity, ethics issues, work-life balance. Others of it was more team oriented. Others of it was giving feedback to your manager. So 12 different distinct areas.
Wow.
So in one sample from one organization, the more task-related issues, the percent favorables on that was well above 70% in terms of employees feeling safe and that they do speak up about these issues. The more personally related ones, between 10 and 20% favorable. Massive differences because of the risk involved in speaking up and the relative comfort level in doing so. In a separate study, and we published an article in Sloan Management Review on this middle of last year. So this is a collaboration with Microsoft. We asked about those different topic areas again, and at least in that sample, the more that employees felt comfortable and the more they voiced across a range of issues, what we would call voice diversity, not just frequency, the more engaged they were across the board. And even they would be more engaged in their task, the work itself, and were better performers. So the kind of the intuition, Brian, that you brought up, that there is some differentiation. I think that answer is yes. It's still under this umbrella concept of safety. It still impacts your calculation about the risks and rewards of speaking up about one topic versus another. But at the same time, if you feel like you can be authentic about things that are personally meaningful for you, even outside of work, that has a tremendous impact on your relationship with the organization and your likelihood to dial in when the time comes.
That is, I would love to see that work, Ethan. So send that to me. One of the things that we are also not presuming at Google is that the feeling that you can be authentic and open and voice about things that are happening personally is equal across all groups. And so on that set of culture, inclusion, and psychological safety issues that we collect through our employee opinion survey, we are cutting that data by gender, ethnicity, the intersection of gender, ethnicity, veteran status, age group, sexual orientation, and other data that we have to see if disproportionately some groups are able to find that safe space, but others are not.
For anyone, thank you, Brian, Ethan, and Amy. For anyone who was interested in Ethan's work, he posted a link to it in chat. So I'm mindful that this is a big topic, and I know there's a lot of interest in this these days. There's another big topic that I want to transition to and spend some of our last remaining time on, because I know Amy, Ethan, and Brian, I've heard each of you comment on it, and I know that it's an important one. We talk about how do you impact the organization's culture? How do you reinforce the behaviors that we want? How do you shape that culture? We talk a lot about performance management. I know it's a kind of a deviation from where we're coming from, but it also fits in. How do you create the environment where people can feel comfortable bringing up these issues of personal relevance to them, not just about the work as well? And so, what gets measured gets done. And so we talk about how do you lay out the task for leaders. Given that, I'll back up. Amy, last year, I asked you a question of, is psychological safety a leadership responsibility? And I think your response was something like, psychological safety is a leader's primary responsibility. And that then makes me wonder, how do you build that into the in a formalized way? What are expected of leaders, and how do you measure it? How do you hold them to that? That comes to that topic of accountability as well. So I guess I'd love to get in that conversation of, what does that performance framework look like? What should it look like? Should something be formalized in their job descriptions and what they're evaluated on in their performance management or in evaluating their performance? If so, I know, Ethan, you at one point brought up concept of like, what are we measuring against? We're measuring against an objective measure of some sort. Right now the leading measure is, Amy, your scale, but we don't have that built into performance expectation necessarily. So, or is it a matter of we're comparing leaders within an organization against each other? And beyond that, what does good look like? What does the right level of psych safety look like? And that ties into compensation and incentives. So it's a whole complex conversation. So let's figure this out in the next 20 minutes. So does anybody, Ethan, I'm going to start with you, because I think that, I hear you commonly, not just because I'm picking on you, but you commonly, talk about and bring up the topic of performance management and how that really serves as kind of the core of holding leaders accountable in this way. What are your thoughts on this?
I guess candidly, it's mixed, and I think this is it's pretty similar to deploying engagement surveys and then holding managers accountable to achieving a certain percent favorable across different dimensions. So organizations should absolutely strive to create this type of culture of psych safety. It should be embedded into the value system. It should be something that they talk about culturally as being important. It's something that leaders should seek to embody and model for everyone else. It should be feedback that is given developmentally if folks are not aware, I think as Brian pointed out before, or not doing it a little bit more purposefully. But for me, as soon as you start measuring it in a way that makes folks accountable, and either through a performance rating, through salary increases, or even through promotions, it starts to create kind of funny dynamics where managers could then start to manage their scores, and that's not always in a functional way. And so that's why for me it's a little bit, it's mixed, and I'm not exactly, to be honest, I'm not exactly sure how to navigate that fine line. It has to be something that's talked about as important, but I'd be afraid of embedding it so much into the system that it's going to create quite perverse incentives.
Everything he said, that's exactly how I think about it. So number one, this is really a dilemma, right? Or it's fraught territory. You're damned if you do and damned if you don't. And so what's the answer? It becomes something like a shared problem to manage, rather than a technical problem to solve, because I don't think you can solve it, right? It's you run the risk that if you have very real incentives, monetary, promotion, and otherwise attached to some number in a survey, you're gonna darn well find a way for that number to go up. It's sort of like when you buy a car and they tell you, please fill this out, it's going to become, oh, and by the way, it has to be a 10. Okay, anyway, so but what I think might be helpful is making the distinction between high and low powered incentives, right? So be very wary of high powered incentives, material financial result rewards, promotion rewards, but low powered incentives of the kind that where you are seen as a valued member, as a culture carrier for this organization, where you're highlighted for doing good things. When you have people in your organization who get seen as the stellar managers around here because they are really good at developing others and helping others develop their talents and their opportunities, then your organization is really set up to thrive. So, more social rewards than financial rewards for creating those kinds of environments that everybody wants to work in.
And then I will present. I'll present a counter perspective here that I have no answer to, and I'm not saying this is what we do, but from the perspective of an employee, if there isn't an actual identifiable accountability for you as a leader creating a certain environment or hearing voice, I don't believe you really care. You say it's important, but there is no identifiable consequence to a leader who hasn't. I have to trust that their manager is having a conversation with them. And I think that is where we have some challenges. I lead performance management at Google, and I feel like every single aspect of performance management has a benefit and then an associated con to it. And it's this, what we hope is we can find the right balance across all of them. But the reality is sometimes you need to say, we're intentionally going to optimize this positive outcome and live with a negative consequence. And this is one of those. So as an example of, on this sort of on the folly of rewarding for A and hoping for B, we're hoping that you're going to get feedback and you're going to learn from it and create more psychologically safe environments. But we've actually held you to a set of quantitative scores that came from your team. And then so I'm thinking I need to get those scores up versus I need to actually engage in the behaviors that the scores were intended to improve. We have started from the basics. How do we show employees that their voice matters? And we do that by having a 360-degree performance management system where all employees are obligated to get feedback from each other. We have also made a somewhat controversial move to have all of that feedback identifiable. So if I have 4 of my peers giving me feedback, I know what they said about me. I go into the tool, I can read it, and there's a certain maturity that needs to be in place in order for you to handle that and not retaliate. It's different when there's a power dynamic. So there's also the opportunity for every Google employee to give their manager upward feedback, and that is not identifiable. It is aggregated and there are open-ended comments, but you don't know who said what, so that there is not an easy route towards retaliation from the manager. It is not an algorithmic input of a quantitative score to a performance outcome, but it is clearly stated that managers' feedback should be considered in calibration session and what score they get. And we trust that there is going to be an acknowledgement of context, a thorough discussion about it. That manager feedback is available to everyone who's calibrating that manager's performance. And so we're hoping that there is a collective understanding of its importance, a thorough and rich discussion on how to apply it. And then finally, at the leadership level, if you are managing thousands of people, I think it's actually appropriate to collect feedback at scale and then bundle that up and give it. I think it's going to be very hard for an organizational leader with thousands of people to exert the power required to actually clamp down across the board on some important elements of culture. So that's the way we've been thinking about. Number one, demonstrate to employees that voice matters by creating mechanisms for them to actually deliver their voice and be accountable for it and have it part of performance management. Be cognizant of power differentials when you make it identifiable or not. Have a thorough discussion about how algorithmic you think you could be or your culture can incorporate, and bringing those scores into your final compensation outcomes or your performance score. And then always remember that leaders, by virtue of their importance, I would say the how for leadership is more important than the how for an individual contributor. And therefore it should be a greater part of the discussion on their performance score and their compensation outcomes.
Amy or Brian, any responses or reactions?
Well, first, I think to state the obvious, I love sitting on a panel with Brian and Amy. I always learn so much when I get to interact with them. I'm going to pick up on one piece about the algorithmic part, and I think we talked about this maybe in one of our pre-sessions. Again, we have no data on this, but the algorithmic part, I think, brings up the the choice about how data around psych safety from various sources is then used. And I think what you're bringing up there is it shouldn't be a linear function. Like going from an 85 to a 90% means that much more of a bump in compensation as a result. That it's probably much more like a stepwise function. And that there's some sort of bare minimum that we should all agree that we should feel. And then beyond that, it's fine, it's cake, it's, you know, the icing on the cake, so to speak. So it's not going to be limiting in some way or need to have that attention drawn to it in that capacity. And then perhaps those, you know, at what cutoffs those stepwise functions are could differ depending on what level you are within the organization. So yeah, I think that's fascinating.
Amy, go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to quickly say, I think it's what Brian describes as a very, very sophisticated and thoughtful response to this perennial challenge that won't go away. And I love the starting framing, which is that every single element of performance management is fundamentally fraught. So once you recognize that, then you start to say, okay, let's do it anyway. Let's figure it out. Right? Let's do the best we can with a wicked problem.
This also makes me, you know, we talk about performance management. Obviously, one outcome is promotion potential or actual promotion as well. And Amy, you mentioned that, you know, if you see the people getting promoted or moving up who are creating those in desirable environments, that's one way that's one less tangible incentive, right? Are we able to select in some way, shape, or form, or identify people who will be more capable, more likely to create those environments? Or is that not really a kind of conversation that's comfortable?
I mean, I think the people in organizations know who the good managers are. And by good manager, you know, good for them, good growth opportunity, you get credit, you know, there's a good team spirit in the team, right? And those are the people that people want to work for, and that ought to be a highly valued set of skills. How exactly you do it is always challenging.
And I agree. And, you know, Google, like most large companies, has engaged in job analysis. And a lot of job analysis is getting beyond the, you know, how many hours am I spending punching keys into my keyboard, and getting much more into the team and leadership levels. And we have identified and verified that investments in team health and respect, et cetera, are actually part of our role. Once you know that, and it's sort of ensconced in this, you know, formal infrastructure for everything else in HR, we then have all the proof we need to build this into our selection system, interview rubrics and things like that for the selection of candidates. And so it ends up being a very defensible set of skills and abilities to use as a screen, and we do that. I think a lot of companies right now are.
Fascinating. Thank you. Brian, I'm going to keep it with you. I know that, you know, prior to this, we were talking about transitioning a little bit, bringing it to, you know, modern day where we're not in person with each other. We're not working in person, and we are all through the screen like we are right now. How have you seen that impact a leader's ability to create psychological safety, or for individuals' experience of psychological safety? I'll open it up to others also. Brian, I call on you because I know we were talking about that more specifically earlier.
Yeah, this is a huge open question for us. Nobody expected that we would be almost entirely working from home and connecting virtually. It just happened. There is, for our company, a pride in our workspaces, a belief that innovation happens when we're together. Like there's just always been something that we've held to be true, that this in-person connection was part of the fabric. And so as we moved into this virtual environment, the open empirical question for us was, can we maintain team health? connection between employees and their managers and our culture overall, can it be sustained? And will there be a decrement in psychological safety? I can say 1 year in, almost 1 year in at this point, all of our indicators are as strong as they were before we went in, and in some cases even higher. Now the question is why. I mean, obviously it's never uniform. These are averages, and there's going to be a distribution around it. But why did we not see this sort of main effect for virtual environment on team health and psychological safety? That I would love to dig into, because I'm not sure of all of the reasons. My cat says hi, by the way. Sorry, she's very loud. So a few of the things that I think are important here. We had to acknowledge the difference in how we're working together and have almost a company-wide conversation about what that means about norms and inclusion. The next is that a lot of, interaction is bounded by the time that we're actually together. There aren't moments when half of the people left and half of them stayed, and then they formed connections and a stronger bond that led to more opportunities for some than others. So there's some sort of a weird egalitarian moment that happened when we were all forced into the same work environment. And then the last thing that I would say is it's just been so challenging. We spend hours, eight hours a day, 10 hours a day with these people that we work with. They end up being our support network. They end up being our friends. They end up being people with whom we're sort of norming our experience. And more and more I see, even in formal meetings, sort of like an accepted 5-minute space for just an exchange of being human beings working in trying times that I think has actually facilitated connection in a healthy way.
Yeah, I'll build on that. So I'll end with the last point that Brian brought up. I've seen a number of our faculty in managing classes do that exact thing. They'll spend the first 10 minutes of class, and let's face it, we all know faculty, we like to talk, and we like to talk in the classroom. And so to give up classroom time for non-structured, personal human connection time is a lot to ask. But that pays such dividends. Just giving them 10 minutes to sync in a one-on-one, in a whole bunch of breakouts via Zoom before launching into the task at hand has such a cultural impact on the class itself. The second, just as a quick hit, in a study with a couple of Amy's colleagues, Allison Brookswood and a doctoral student, we're looking at the impact of eye gaze on psychological safety. And one of our manipulations is through the placement of cameras over Zoom. So I also know we've all experienced a person whose camera is off to the side as they are talking, and it has an impact, like it or not. And so, thinking about some of those small, subtle cues of human connection, even in the place of your Zoom camera, has a tremendous impact on psych safety in that regard. And then the last one is thinking about hopefully a not so distant future state where we are starting to think about return to work. A lot of companies I've been talking to, it's not going to be a clean slate where we're working 100% virtual and now we're back 40, 60 hours a week, 100% in person. There's going to be a transition period. And there's some excellent work out there about coordinating the times where people are in the office versus at home, and making sure that some of that coordination among teams means that they are spending in-person time together when you're only transitioning 1, 2, or 3 days in the office. So having some forethought and planning there, even at the team level for the return to work schedules, can be hugely important.
Thanks, Ethan. Yeah, you touched on something I've been thinking a lot about. Why can't we have technology where the camera's built into the screen somewhere so we can look at the screen, look at your eyes? Right? That's $1 million idea right there. My personal computer, the camera is at the bottom, which is bizarre to me. I see we only have a few minutes left. I want to ask each of you in closing, are there any areas that we didn't talk about, maybe we don't have answers to, but that you'd like the audience to be thinking about, whether it's in practice to try new ways of doing or whether it's in research and science, to try to get some answers and figure out what best practice should look like in terms of how organizations can institutionalize within their processes, structures, systems, practices, norms to create psychological safety. I'll go top to bottom in my listing. Brian, you're first for me. Where would you like to challenge people?
So I really just want to go back to part of our conversation here. Please help us expand the construct of psychological safety to make connections between psychological safety at work, safety in bringing myself to work, authenticity, belonging, inclusion. Like, these are all interrelated constructs, but they also have some differentiation, I believe. And so I would just love to see that construct space acknowledged as interdependent and start to see it sort of as a cohesive human experience in the workplace. I just think that that's going to lead to greater learning. And then what I eventually hope is it's going to help us train leaders across the board to be more facile, and elements of leadership that may not be emphasized as much today as they could be.
Thank you, Brian. I appreciate it. Ethan, you're next up for me.
So I guess I have two kind of closing points on that. The first is something that's really top of mind for me is sort of the downstream outcomes of managing psych safety well. And, you know, if we do it well, there's going to be a lot of voice. And I've had lots of conversations with Brian about this at Google. Google has a very healthy culture and a lot of voice. That doesn't mean that all those ideas are implemented. And that healthy balance of how to say no, how to let someone down, how to keep them feeling safe over a long period of time is such a huge challenge. And I don't think we have good, rich empirical data on that. It's, you know, the unintended consequences of managing this well. It's still challenging. And so the last thing I'll mention is something that Brian talked about as well, and that's the need for good, rigorous, thoughtful research around this. And there are lots of folks, both on the practice side, but also on the academic side, that are interested in these issues. For the academics, we're relatively cheap dates in terms of sparking up collaborations and seeing some outcomes. But it does take sort of a leap of faith and trying a bunch of experiments, then some of which won't always turn out to bear fruit. But to me, that's also an important set of actions and endeavors to embark on, because that's the way we actually learn about some of this stuff.
Thank you, Ethan. I appreciate it. And Amy, let's close it out with you. I'd love to hear where you want us to go next.
Two headlines. One builds exactly on what Ethan and Brian were talking about, which is more emphasis on interpersonal skill, right? More emphasis on measuring and developing the kinds of skills that allow us to have high quality conversations once we're speaking up, right? And I could go on that, so I won't. The second one is more data. I really would love to see data. I'm asked about it all the time. Love to team up with anyone who's interested in getting this, that would give us a better sense of the landscape, cross country, cross expertise, professional expertise area, identity group area. I think we probably the number one topic that has come up for me throughout this last year, loud and clear that we don't have enough research on, is the topic of diversity, inclusion, and psychological safety. So maybe that was three things, but the second one can go under that second one.
Brian, Ethan, Amy, it's always a pleasure to work with you and to chat with you. Thank you for your time. Everyone who joined us, thank you so much for being with us and for your questions. Lauren, thank you for behind the scenes help with the Zoom facilitation. If anybody has any further questions, please feel free to reach out. It's been wonderful, and I look forward to the next time. Take care, y'all.
Thanks, everyone.